Hello and welcome to Mighty Rooks. This is Amar and today I will be showing you some of the very important things about the game of chess. In the Beginner's Guide Part 1, we have already learned how to set up the board, what are the important squares on the chessboard, and how do we write moves. What are the names of all the squares on the board, and what are the key areas one should be knowing on the chessboard. In this video, we will be seeing chess pieces, their movements, their values, and what are the important things about these chess pieces one should know before he starts playing chess. As we can see, the pawns for both the players are standing on the second rank, respectively. The pawns always move forward, so as the game of chess is always started by the white player, the first move will be made by white. So white pawns will always move forward and they will advance towards black side of the board, like this. The pawn cannot turn back, it cannot move backwards. So once the pawn is moved, it will only go forward. The pawn capture other pieces or pawns in a different way. The pawn that stands on e4 will control the squares d5 and f5. So it is very important to know that if this pawn finds any black piece on these two squares, it can go ahead and capture them. It is totally up to the player if he feels the capture is favorable for his position. The pawn has another way to capture the other pawn, that is called en passant. We'll see that in some time. At the first move, the pawn can move two squares or one square. It is up to the player to decide whether he wants to put his pawn one square forward or two squares, like this. As we can see on the board, there are a few pawn moves which we have made, and let's check out what all possible captures do we have on the board right now. So d takes c5. Let's assume it's white to play. So white has the option of taking the c5 pawn with his d4 pawn. White can take f6 pawn with its e5 pawn, or he can play c takes d5. So there are three captures possible for white player right now. Let's discuss en passant capture now. The pawn's only piece in the game that has this exclusive move which they can do. It's called en passant. It's a special pawn capture where the player on the immediate next move has to capture the pawn. Let's check the diagram to get the better idea. When the player's pawn reaches in the 5th rank and the opponent's pawn passes the pawn that has reached the 5th rank, the player has a choice to take the pawn on the immediate next move. As we can see in the diagram, the pawn on e5 is stopping f7 pawn and d7 pawn to advance to d5 or f5 respectively. If the pawn is played to d5, the pawn on e5 can capture the d5 pawn by e takes d6, and this move has to be done on the immediate next move. Let's assume if white chooses to play d4, Now this option of capturing this pawn and getting it out of the board is impossible in this particular game for white. So white has to capture this pawn on the immediate next move, and this exactly is called en passant. So similarly, if we can see for black, let's assume white plays f4, black plays d4, and now if white player plays c4, this pawn can take the c4 pawn by d takes c3. Remember, the en passant rule is only for the pawns that are in adjacent files. If the pawn is on 5th rank in the e file, it cannot take this pawn if it is played to c5. So this is not the normal range of a pawn. As we all know, pawns control only these two squares. As we discuss about these pawns, let's discuss what is a pawn promotion. A pawn promotion is basically when the pawn reaches in the 8th rank by going forward, it can become a queen or a rook or a knight or a bishop. As we can see in the diagram, the pawn has reached e7, and the moment white player promotes his pawn to e8, he can opt for new queen or a rook or knight or a bishop. It is totally player's choice or the demand of the position which piece to be taken. Most of the times we'll see the pawn promoting to a queen. Important point to remember is pawn is worth 1 point, and about en passant, it is not a compulsory move. The player should know that if he is in en passant position where he can have en passant capture, it is not at all compulsory for him to capture the pawn. He can just continue the game without capturing the pawn by en passant rule. Let's discuss about knights. Knights are the pieces which have special moves and special powers, unlike any other piece in the game. The knights can jump over the pieces, and they have a very unique way of moving. The knights at the starting position stand on g1, b1, and for black it's g8 and b8. These are the only pieces that can make the first move after pawns. So the knights at the first move can go to a3, c3, or this knight can go to f3 and h3. Similarly for black knights, they can go to a6, c6, or f6 and h6. Let's check out the diagrams to get better idea of how knights move. As we can see on the screen, the knight standing on e4 can go to c5, d6, f6, g5, g3, f2, d2, or c3. So if this knight finds any black piece on the highlighted square, it has a choice to capture them as he is controlling these squares. What we can see over here is the notation for the knight. So when we write knight moves, we use letter N, and the knight is worth 3 points. It is important to know that knight is the only piece that can jump over the pieces, as we have already said. The knights are very important pieces when the position is closed, and that's exactly when they can use their special power of jumping over the pieces. We'll discuss about open position and closed positions later. What we can see is from one of the central squares, the knight can control 8 squares. So it is important for the player to know that the knight has more powers when it's placed in the central squares. So knight at the side of the board, let's assume on these squares or at the corners, it will have a very limited accessibility to these squares and control very less of the board. Now let's discuss something about bishops. At the starting position, the bishops stand on f1, c1, f8 and c8. They are very unusual pieces because a single bishop can only go to the 50% of the board. That is, if the bishop is a light squared bishop, then he can only go to the light squares and he cannot ever go in the dark squares. And that's what makes these pieces very interesting and very powerful at times. The bishops are long-range pieces and they control big diagonals. Let's assume e4 is played and immediately this bishop starts controlling f1 a6 diagonal. Let's check the diagram to get better idea about bishops. As we can see, the bishop on e4 is controlling 13 squares and the highlighted squares are the ones which are being controlled. If any of the black piece is found on these highlighted squares, this bishop can go ahead and capture them. He is basically controlling these many squares, so the pieces on these squares will be supported by this bishop. The bishop is noted by the letter B, so when the right moves we use the capital letter B, and the points for the bishops are 3. So knights and bishops have pretty much similar values, but they have different features and different favorable conditions or positions during the game. Unlike knights, bishops enjoy open board and they like open positions because then they can use their long range powers and they can control maximum squares. The bishops should always be placed outside the pawn chains. If their own pawns are standing in the bishop's way, it will be very difficult for the bishop to get more and more access to the board and control more squares. As we can see, it is a dark squared bishop standing on d4 and controlling all the highlighted squares. Let's discuss something very important about these bishops. Because these bishops move in their own colored squares, so at the starting position, if the bishop is standing in dark square, it will only go in dark squares. They have this very important thing about them, that is, they cannot capture the bishops of opposite colors. What exactly I meant by that is the bishop on f1 can never capture the bishop on f8. That is, they both travel in opposite color diagonals and they will never face each others during the game. So this bishop can only capture this bishop during the game, or it can it can capture any other piece that he finds on these squares. But it is impossible for this bishop to capture this particular bishop during the game. And it's similar for this bishop and this bishop here. Now let's discuss about the rooks. The rooks are heavy pieces. These are called major pieces. Generally, bishops and knights are considered to be minor pieces, and rooks and queen are considered to be major pieces. So rook is a very strong piece, and it has a power to control the entire file. So the worth of rook is more than that of bishop or knight. Let's check out the diagram to get better idea. As we can see, the rook is standing on e4 and it is controlling 14 squares. So the rooks can go horizontally or vertically. So the rook at e4 will control the highlighted squares and it will capture any black piece that he finds on these squares. The rook has value of 5 points and it is considered one of the very important pieces. The notation for rook, capital letter R, and we use this while we write the rook moves. Both white and black start with 2 rooks each, and one has to believe that the rooks are typical pieces that find themselves in endgame a lot of time, because they are placed at the corner of the board and they feel the heat of the game in a very later phase. Most of the times. There are exceptions in every rule. So let's discuss about queen. Both players start with 1 queen each, and the queen is the most powerful piece in the game. So players have to be very careful when they make queen moves, and they should know whether they are putting their queen in a safe square. Queen is the strongest piece in the game, and it can move like a bishop and like a rook together. So from the central square it can control 27 squares, that is 13 of the bishop and 14 of the rook. So let's check the diagram to get better idea. In the diagram we can see the queen standing at e4. As we can see, it's covering almost 50% of the board. So it is a very powerful piece, and the queen is almost a decisive factor during the game unless player sacrifices the queen on purpose. The queen is worth 9 points, so it is the most valued piece amongst all the pieces, and the queen moves are written by the letter Q. So in this particular diagram we can say QE4. Now let's discuss about the king. King is the most important piece in the game. Its count is infinite, and you cannot really make any value of the king, because the army in chess stands and falls with its king. So if the king is lost, then it's said to be the game is lost and the game is over. So the player has to make sure that he is never ever finding his king trapped or king in a position where it can't save himself. So let's see how the king moves and what are the important things one should know about his king. As we can see, the king is standing on d5. It can go to c6, d6, e6, e5, e4, d4, c4 and c5. So king in one go can go only one square in any direction. So it is important for the player to know that king doesn't have a long range and it can only go one square in any direction. It is very important for the player to know that he shouldn't be taking out his king because it can be attacked by the opponent's army. The king becomes very active when the game is in the endgame phase. Let's see some special moves that king can make. As we can see in the diagram, the king and rook can make a special move that is called castling. As we can see the highlighted paths of the king and rook and their destination squares. So the king will jump to g1, skipping one square, and rook will jump to f1, skipping one square. And the player has to touch his king first because castling is king's move. And similarly, the king can castle on the other side, which is called long side or queen side. This castling is called long castle. The king in this case jumps to c1 and the rook skips two squares, that is b1 and c1, and lands on d1. The castle has a particular purpose, that is, first of all, it gets your king to a safer side of the board behind the pawns, and it stops your opponent to attack the king immediately, and also it connects both the rooks, and the rooks then can join the action by getting themselves into the central files. Let's see the position when the player does castling. This is the position when both players have made short castle. Short castling is done on the king side, as we have already discussed how the move is played. You have to play the king first, remember. The castle is a king's move, and in case of long castle, the king goes to c1 and rook comes to d1. Similarly, for the black player, king goes to c8 and rook goes to d8. And look at this, both kings are behind the pawns, the rooks are active, and that's exactly the purpose of castling. In most of the cases, castling is a very helpful move, as it saves the king from getting exposed to the enemy pieces. But there are positions when you don't need to castle, because king sometimes in the center helps a lot in the positional play. Most of the times in the closed games, you will see castling is getting delayed. It is advised to the beginner level players that they should castle as soon as possible, because that will make their king a little safer and it will be difficult for the opponent to make easy attacks on the king. Let's see some of the important criteria one has to fulfill to castle during the game. In the diagram, we can see the bishop on b4 is controlling the square f8. So it is impossible for the black player to castle on the king side, because the king has to jump from the f8 square to g8. So whenever the king has to travel from the square that is controlled by the opponent's piece, it is not possible to castle. So the king cannot travel from the check, and exactly why the white player cannot castle on the queen side, as this pawn that has reached to the b2 square is controlling the c1 square where the king is going to land. So in this particular case, we can have white player castling on the short side or a king side, and the black player can castle on the queen side. Remember, if the rook is attacked, the player still can castle. As we can see, the f3 bishop is attacking the rook on a8. There is a lot of confusion in the players if they can castle at the occasion when their rook is being attacked. It is absolutely fine to castle when the rook is attacked, but the king is not attacked, or he is not going through the check, or the square that where he'll be landing is not controlled by the enemy pieces. One more thing one has to remember is when they castle, it is important that their king and rook are still on the starting position. They have not moved their rooks or the king. Let's assume if this rook was played to c8 during the game, and then if black players decides to long castle, so he thinks that he can put the rook from c8 to d8, and let's put the king to c8. That's impossible. So that's pretty much it. Important things to remember about castle is the king cannot castle when it's in check. The king cannot castle if the square that it is going to is being controlled by the opponent's piece, and it cannot castle if the square that it has to skip is also being controlled by the opponent's piece. That's pretty much it. We have covered almost all the rules of chess. I guess you will be able to understand more about the game of chess with this video. I wish you all the best for your chess, and if you like this video, do subscribe to my channel, and we will be discussing some more helpful chess related information in our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching videos. Good luck.